I want to talk to you today about something so personal, something that I believe every single one of us struggles with at some point in our lives: how to restore our spiritual sight. If you've ever felt like you were walking through life blind, unsure of where to go, what to do, or how to hear God in the midst of everything happening around you, this message is for you. If you've been overwhelmed by the noise of the world, if your heart feels like it's just numb to the things of God, if you feel disconnected from the truth, I want to remind you, God can restore your spiritual sight. He can open your eyes again, and He can help you see the truth, even when everything around you seems to be in chaos. And I don't care where you are right now, how far you feel from Him, or how much darkness is clouding your vision, God can restore your spiritual sight. There are moments in life when you feel like you've lost your way. You don't know which direction to go. You can't see the next step. It's like you're walking in the dark. And for some of you, this has been a long season. It might feel like God has been silent, like His presence is distant, like you're stumbling through life with no clear vision. You know you're supposed to trust God. You know you're supposed to lean on Him, but the path feels foggy. And because of that, your heart feels heavy, burdened, uncertain. And I just want to say this to you right now. Don't give up. Don't lose hope. Just because you can't see clearly in this moment doesn't mean that God has left you. Just because you're walking through a season of blindness doesn't mean that you're destined to stay there. There is hope for you. There is a way to restore your spiritual sight. Do you know that it's actually possible for your spiritual sight to be restored? It's not just a nice idea. It's not just some lofty concept that sounds good but doesn't really happen. No, restoration of sight is something that God can do. He can open your eyes to see what He wants you to see. He can help you see through the eyes of faith, to see what's not visible to the natural eye, to see what He is doing even when you can't see it. The key to restoring your sight is not just about trying harder, not about forcing things to happen in your own strength, but about letting go and allowing God to open your eyes. It's about surrendering to Him and trusting that He can bring back the vision that you've lost. The Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 5:7, for we live by faith, not by sight. I believe that verse is a reminder to us that our natural sight is limited. We can only see what is in front of us, what we can touch, what we can experience with our five senses. But faith opens our spiritual eyes to a whole new world, a whole new reality. It helps us to see what God sees, to understand His will, and to trust in His goodness, even when we can't understand what's going on around us. The key to restoring your spiritual sight is allowing God to open your eyes to His truth, His will, and His purpose for your life, even when it seems unclear. I want to take you on a journey through the Bible today, and I want you to see how God opened the eyes of people who were walking in spiritual blindness. In the book of 2 Kings, there's a powerful story about Elisha and his servant. The Bible tells us that Elisha and his servant were surrounded by the enemy. An entire army had come to take them captive. The servant was terrified. He looked around, and all he could see was the enemy. All he could see were the overwhelming odds against them. And in that moment, Elisha prayed and asked God to open his servant's eyes. And when God opened his eyes, the servant saw the heavenly army that surrounded them, the army of angels that had been there the entire time, protecting them from the enemy. In 2 Kings 6:17, Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." And God opened the servant's eyes, and in that moment he realized that they were not alone. The servant's sight was restored, and he saw the power of God that had been with them all along. The enemy that had seemed so big, so overwhelming, was nothing compared to the power of God that was on their side. It was a moment of clarity, a moment when the truth of God's presence became real to them. And I believe that is exactly what God wants to do in your life today. He wants to open your eyes to the reality of His presence, to the truth that He is with you, that He is working on your behalf, even when you can't see it. What if your spiritual blindness is not because God has left you, but because you've become so overwhelmed by what's happening around you that you've stopped seeing what God is doing? What if God is right there with you, but you can't see Him because you're looking at the wrong things? What if the key to restoring your sight is not just about asking God to fix your circumstances, but asking Him to help you see what He is doing right now, right in the middle of the struggle? I want to challenge you today to open your heart and ask God to restore your sight. Just like Elisha prayed for his servant, ask God to open your eyes. Ask him to help you see what he sees, to show you the truth behind the lies, to open your eyes to the power and the presence that is with you, even when everything feels uncertain. Because I believe that when your spiritual sight is restored, you will begin to see things differently. You'll begin to see your circumstances through the lens of faith. You'll begin to see that God has been working all along, even when you couldn't see it. There's another story in the Bible that I want you to see. It's the story of the blind man who was healed by Jesus in John 9. This man had been blind from birth. He had never seen a single thing. And when Jesus encountered him, he did something that was completely unexpected. He spat on the ground, made mud, and placed it on the man's eyes. Then Jesus told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. So what did the man do? And when the man obeyed, his sight was restored. He could see. The transformation was miraculous. But here's what stands out to me. When the man was healed, his neighbors didn't recognize him. They couldn't believe it was the same person. He had been blind his whole life, and now he could see. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit into the boxes they had put him in. But that's the thing about God's work in our lives. It doesn't always make sense to the world around us. The way he restores our sight, the way he brings healing and transformation doesn't always look like what we expect. But it's real, it's powerful, and it's life-changing. When Jesus healed the blind man, he didn't just restore his physical sight, he also gave him spiritual sight. The man came to know Jesus in a deeper way. And in John 9:35-38, we see that he eventually worshiped Jesus, recognizing him as the Son of God. The healing of his physical blindness led to a deeper spiritual awakening. And I believe that God wants to do that for you today. He wants to not only restore your physical and emotional sight, but he wants to give you a deeper understanding of who he is. He wants to help you see with spiritual eyes, to know his heart, to hear his voice, and to walk in his truth. So how do you restore your spiritual sight? First, you have to acknowledge that you can't do it on your own. You have to admit that you need God to open your eyes. You have to recognize that your natural sight is limited and you need his supernatural sight to see beyond the surface. Second, you need to spend time with God. You need to draw close to him, to listen for his voice and to seek his presence. The more you get to know God, the clearer your spiritual sight will become. Third, you need to trust his process. Restoration takes time. Just like the blind man had to wash in the pool of Siloam, there's often a process to restoration. You have to trust that God is working, even when you can't see the full picture. And finally, you need to walk in obedience. Just like the servant of Elisha had to see through the eyes of faith, and just like the blind man had to follow Jesus' instructions, you need to take steps of faith, even when you don't fully understand everything. God wants to restore your spiritual sight today. He wants to open your eyes to his love, his truth, and his power. He wants you to see clearly, to walk confidently, and to trust in his goodness. No matter where you are, no matter what you're going through, God can restore your sight. Don't give up. Ask him to open your eyes today and watch as he reveals to you the beautiful plans he has for your life. There are times in life when you feel like everything around you is dim, like you're walking through a fog. It's hard to see the next step, hard to hear God's voice, and hard to know where to turn. Maybe you've been living in this fog for a long time. You've tried to get back to where you once were, to feel the closeness of God's presence, but it feels like the more you reach out, the more you struggle to connect. There's a deep longing within you for clarity, for direction, and for peace. And if you're being honest, you've started to wonder if you've lost it, lost your spiritual sight, your connection to God's presence, or your ability to hear him speaking to you. You're not alone in this. So many of us have walked through seasons where we feel spiritually blind, unable to see clearly, unsure of what God is doing, or even where he is in our lives. The first step in restoring our spiritual sight is acknowledging that we are blind. This is where it all begins. It's easy to get caught up in the rush of life and try to pretend that everything is fine, even when we know deep down that we're struggling. We tell ourselves that we don't need help, that we can figure it out on our own. We go through the motions of faith, showing up to church, praying here and there, reading a verse or two, but our hearts are distant and our minds are distracted. The truth is, until we admit that we can't see clearly, that we've become spiritually blind, we won't begin the process of restoration. We won't be able to fully open our hearts to God's healing work if we're in denial about the state of our soul. Acknowledging that you're spiritually blind is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of humility. It's an acknowledgement that you don't have it all together and that you need God to open your eyes. It's saying, God, I can't see clearly on my own. I need you to show me the way. It takes a lot of courage to admit that we need help, but that is the very place where God begins to do his work in us. You see, God loves honesty. He knows where we are, but he waits for us to recognize it, to admit that we are lost in the fog and need his light to guide us. There's a story in the Bible that highlights this truth so beautifully. In John 9, we meet a man who was born blind. He had never seen a single thing. For years, he lived in that blindness, never knowing the world outside, never experiencing the beauty of a sunrise, the faces of people he loved, or even the colors that surrounded him. His blindness was not something he had chosen. It wasn't his fault, but it was his reality. And yet one day, Jesus came across this man and healed him in the most unexpected way. He spat on the ground, made mud, and put it on the blind man's eyes, telling him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. It didn't make sense. It wasn't what the man had expected. But when the man obeyed and washed, his eyes were open. He could see for the first time in his life. But before the man could be healed, something needed to happen. He had to first recognize that he was blind. This may seem obvious to us, but there are many who live their entire lives in blindness without even knowing it. We can get so accustomed to the darkness, so used to living without vision, that we don't even recognize that we're blind. But when Jesus came and spoke to this man, he didn't just heal his physical blindness. He was also inviting him into a deeper awareness, a deeper understanding. The healing process started with the man acknowledging his blindness and being willing to receive the miracle. If the man had not admitted his blindness, he would never have been in the position to receive the healing that would change his life forever. This is true for all of us. We have to be willing to admit that we can't see. We have to recognize that we're walking in a fog, in confusion, in despair, in doubt, and in fear. We need to allow ourselves to feel the weight of that blindness before we can allow God to bring us into the light. God doesn't force himself on us. He invites us to come to him, to acknowledge where we are, to confess the blindness in our hearts. Once we do that, the healing can begin. For some of you, this may be a difficult thing to do. Admitting that you're spiritually blind means confronting the areas of your life where you feel the most vulnerable. It means being honest about the things you've been ignoring, the parts of your heart you've been hiding, the pain you've been running from. It means stepping into a place of humility where you stop pretending that everything is fine and admit that you need God to help you see again. But I want to encourage you to take that step. Don't be afraid to admit that you're struggling, that you can't see clearly, and that you need God's help. The moment you do, you will begin to experience the grace and the healing that only He can offer. Spiritual blindness doesn't just come from living in a world full of distractions and noise, although that is certainly a factor. It can also come from experiences of pain, disappointment, and heartbreak. When life doesn't go the way we expect, when we pray for something and don't see the answer we hope for, when we face the brokenness of the world, it's easy for our hearts to grow weary. It's easy to become disillusioned and lose sight of the truth. And in those moments, the temptation is to turn inward, to get lost in our own doubts and confusion. The longer we stay in that place of self-focus, the harder it becomes to see what God is doing, to hear His voice, or to feel His presence. When we allow ourselves to become disillusioned or discouraged, we start to build walls around our hearts. We stop believing that God is working, that He's moving in our lives, and that He's present in our pain. The fog of life can grow so thick that we forget the truth. God is with us even in the moments when we can't feel Him. But it takes a decision, a choice, to open our hearts again and invite God in. We have to choose to believe that He is still there even when we can't see or understand what He's doing. And that begins with acknowledging where we are, in a place of blindness, a place of longing for clarity, for truth, and for peace. This is the starting point of restoration. You can't fix what you won't admit is broken. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge is sick. And you can't open your eyes if you don't first recognize that they are closed. But once you do, once you acknowledge the blindness in your heart and in your life, God can step in and do what only He can do. He can restore your vision, He can heal your heart, and He can open your eyes to the things you've been missing all along. There's another beautiful truth in the Bible about spiritual sight. In Luke 24, there's a story of two disciples walking on the road to Emmaus after the death of Jesus. They were walking in sadness, confusion, and disbelief, unsure of what had just happened. They had witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus and were devastated. But then Jesus appeared to them, and they didn't recognize Him. They were walking with Jesus, talking with Him, but they couldn't see who He was. It wasn't until later, when Jesus broke bread with them, that their eyes were opened. In that moment, they saw Jesus for who He truly was. Their spiritual sight was restored. But it took an encounter with Jesus, and it took a willingness to recognize the truth when it was revealed. In the same way, there are times in our lives when we walk in confusion, in sadness, or in fear, and we don't recognize that God is right there with us. We may be walking through life surrounded by His presence, but we're so focused on our circumstances that we don't see Him. But just like the disciples, our eyes can be opened. We can begin to recognize Jesus in our lives again. But it requires us to stop and pay attention. It requires us to take a moment to listen, to look with the eyes of faith, and to allow God to reveal Himself to us. He is always with us, even when we can't see Him. But our eyes must be open to the truth that He is there, that He is present, and that He is working. Restoring your spiritual sight begins with the choice to acknowledge that you're blind. It starts with the honest recognition that you need God's help, that you're struggling, and that you long for clarity. It's the place of humility where you admit that you can't do it on your own, and you invite God to open your eyes. Once you make that choice, once you invite God to restore your sight, you can begin to walk in the fullness of His light and truth. The fog will start to lift, and you will begin to see clearly again. It's not an instant process, but it's a process that starts with the most important step, acknowledging where you are. And when you do, God will meet you right there and begin to lead you into the light. When we talk about restoring our spiritual sight, it's not just a matter of acknowledging our blindness. It's about doing something about it. It's one thing to recognize that we're lost, confused, or distant from God, but it's something entirely different to take the necessary steps to restore that sight. Spiritual sight is not something that can be restored by sheer willpower or by trying harder. It's not about forcing our way into a relationship with God. It's about drawing near to Him, seeking His presence, and allowing Him to reveal His truth to us. This is where the real transformation happens, when we make the intentional decision to seek God and spend time in His presence. This might seem like a simple point, but I want you to hear this with your heart. The restoration of spiritual sight comes through intimacy with God. The more we seek Him, the clearer our vision becomes. The more we sit in His presence, the more our eyes are opened to the truth. It's in His presence that our hearts are softened, our minds are renewed, and our eyes are open to the reality of His love, His goodness, and His plan for our lives. When you find yourself in a place where everything is cloudy, where you can't see clearly, the solution isn't to try harder to figure it out on your own. It's to stop, breathe, and ask God to open your eyes. It's to seek His face, to draw near to Him, and to let Him be the one who brings clarity to your life. Spending time with God isn't just about checking a box off your to-do list or following a set routine. It's about opening your heart to Him and saying, God, I need You. I need Your presence to guide me. I need Your truth to show me the way I can't see on my own. Please open my eyes. That's the kind of prayer that invites God to step in and restore your sight. It's in the quiet moments, in the stillness, where He speaks to us most clearly. You see, we often get so caught up in the noise of life, the demands, the distractions, the stress, that we forget how essential it is to spend time just being with God. We forget how important it is to still our hearts and let Him speak. But in that stillness, that quiet place is where the transformation begins. In Matthew 6:6, Jesus tells us, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Jesus didn't just say, pray when you're in trouble. He didn't say, pray when you feel like it's a good time. He said, go into your room and close the door. That's about making space. That's about carving out time away from the distractions and the noise to sit with God. It's about getting away from everything that's competing for your attention and making room for God to speak to your heart. Restoration doesn't happen in the rush of life. It happens in the quiet, the still moments when we make the intentional choice to draw near to Him. But here's the thing, drawing near to God is not a one-time event. It's a daily practice. It's a rhythm of life. It's a choice we make every single day to carve out time, even when we're busy, even when we don't feel like it, even when we feel disconnected. We have to make time to spend with God because that's where the restoration of our sight begins. The more we seek Him, the more we will see. The more we invest in our relationship with God, the more clearly we will understand His will for our lives. The more we sit with Him, the more we will begin to recognize His voice, even in the midst of life's noise. And let me tell you something, it doesn't always have to be a long, drawn-out process. Sometimes it's the simple act of pausing for a moment during the day, taking a deep breath and saying, God, I need you right now. Sometimes it's stopping in the middle of your busy routine to pray and ask for His help. Other times it may be a few minutes of worship or reading a verse that speaks to your heart. It doesn't matter how long it is or how perfect it looks. What matters is that you are intentionally seeking God and opening your heart to His presence. In Psalm 27:8, David says, my heart says of you, seek His face. Your face, Lord, I will seek. This is the attitude of a heart that is desperate for God. David knew the importance of seeking God's face, not just His hand. So often we come to God asking for His blessings, for His provision, for His help. And while it's not wrong to ask for those things, seeking God's face is a different level of intimacy. It's coming to Him not just for what He can give us, but for who He is. It's about desiring His presence above all else, knowing that when we seek Him, He will open our eyes to the things we cannot see on our own. It's the heart that says, God, I just want you. I want to know you more. I want to hear your voice. I want to see what you see. Sometimes the fog and the blindness in our lives are a result of not truly seeking God's face. We may go through the motions of faith, doing the right things, saying the right words, but our hearts are far from Him. We may be more focused on the things of this world than on the presence of God. But when we make the decision to seek God with all our hearts, He promises that we will find Him. And when we find Him, our sight will be restored. He will open our eyes to see the things we've been missing. He will reveal His truth to us, and that truth will set us free. It's also important to note that seeking God's presence isn't just about seeking an experience or a feeling. It's about seeking His will, His truth, and His direction for our life. When we draw near to God, we're inviting Him to change our perspective, to give us His heart, and to align our vision with His. Often we come to God looking for answers, and that's okay. But even more than answers, we need to seek His presence so that we can see things from His perspective. We need to ask Him to show us His will, to give us wisdom, and to reveal His truth in the midst of our struggles. When we seek God's presence, we're asking Him to guide us, to restore our vision, and to help us see things the way He sees them. I know that there are times in life when it feels like God is distant, like He's not answering your prayers, or like He's not speaking to you. And in those moments, it can be easy to get frustrated or discouraged. But I want to remind you that God's presence is always available to us. He is never far away. In fact, He promises in James 4:8, come near to God and He will come near to you. It's not about trying to force God's presence into our lives. It's about making space for Him and drawing near to Him. When we do that, He will meet us where we are. He will open our eyes. He will speak to our hearts, and He will restore our spiritual sight. When you make the choice to seek God, it's not a one-time fix. It's a journey. It's about continually returning to His presence time and time again and letting Him transform you. Sometimes restoration takes time. It's a process, but every moment spent with God is a moment of transformation. Every time you come into His presence, He's opening your eyes a little bit more. Every time you seek Him, He's renewing your vision, helping you see things clearly. Restoration isn't a one-time event. It's a lifelong process of drawing near to God, seeking His face, and allowing Him to open your eyes. This is where the real transformation happens, in the quiet, intimate moments with God. It's not about how much you do for God, how many good deeds you accomplish, or how often you go to church. It's about your heart, your willingness to seek Him, and your openness to His presence. When you draw near to God, He will meet you there. He will restore your spiritual sight, and He will help you see things the way He sees them. And in that process, your life will be transformed. You will no longer walk in the fog or confusion, but you will walk in the light of His truth and His love. You will see His will clearly, and you will begin to walk in the direction He has for your life. So I encourage you today, seek God's presence. Make room for Him in your life. Draw near to Him and let Him restore your spiritual sight. When you seek Him, He will open your eyes. He will reveal Himself to you in ways you never imagined, and you will begin to see the world around you through His eyes. It's not just about seeking answers. It's about seeking Him, the one who holds all the answers, the one who will guide you and give you the vision you need for your life. There's something so profound about trusting God's timing and process when it comes to the restoration of our spiritual sight. I know it's hard. I know that when you're in the midst of spiritual blindness, when you can't see where you're going, or when everything feels uncertain, waiting on God can feel like an eternity. We live in a world that is conditioned for instant gratification. We're used to getting things fast. The microwave pings, the smartphone buzzes, the email inbox fills, and we can get answers in seconds. So when we find ourselves in a season where the fog won't lift and the answers aren't coming, it's easy to feel frustrated and impatient. But here's the truth. God's timing is perfect, even when it feels like He's taking too long. God doesn't operate on our timetable. His ways are higher than ours. His plans are greater than anything we can fathom. And when we trust His timing, when we surrender to His process, we open ourselves up to the kind of restoration that's not just superficial or temporary. It's the kind of restoration that goes deep, the kind that changes the way we see the world, the way we live, and the way we relate to Him. His process might not always make sense to us, but we can trust that He is working behind the scenes, shaping and molding us into the people He created us to be. There's a story in the Bible that exemplifies this concept beautifully. The healing of the blind man in John 9. If you know the story, you know that Jesus comes across a man who has been blind from birth. His disciples, in their limited understanding, asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" They wanted a simple answer, an easy explanation, a quick fix. But Jesus responds, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Right there, Jesus challenges our assumptions. He turns their way of thinking upside down. He shows them that not everything that happens to us is a result of something we did wrong. Sometimes the process of restoration is not about something being wrong in us, but about God working through us in ways we cannot understand. Jesus then spits on the ground, makes mud with the saliva, and puts it on the man's eyes, telling him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. It wasn't the way anyone expected healing to happen. It was strange. It was messy. It didn't make sense. But that's the point. When God works in our lives, sometimes it's not in ways we can anticipate or understand. It's not in the ways we think it should happen. We want a quick solution. We want the problem fixed now. We want our spiritual sight restored immediately. But God's ways are different. Jesus didn't just heal the man instantly. There was a process involved. The man had to follow Jesus's instructions step by step. And only after he obeyed did his sight come back. And that's the same with us. Restoration doesn't always happen in an instant, and it certainly doesn't always happen the way we expect. Sometimes we find ourselves walking through a season where we feel like we're in the dark, where we can't see clearly, where we wonder if God even hears our prayers. And in those moments, it's tempting to question the process. It's tempting to doubt God's timing. But I want to encourage you, just because you can't see the results yet doesn't mean God isn't working. Even when it feels like you're walking in darkness, even when it feels like God is distant, He is still moving. He is still working behind the scenes. Trust the process. Trusting God's timing is also about recognizing that He is more interested in who we are becoming than in what we are achieving. We get so focused on the destination that we forget about the journey. We want to be healed, restored, and made whole, and we want it now. But God knows that the process of getting there is just as important as the end result. It's in the waiting, in the seasons of uncertainty and confusion, that our character is shaped. It's in the waiting that God is teaching us patience, endurance, and faith. It's in the waiting that He is revealing more of Himself to us, teaching us to trust Him even when we don't understand. When we look at the story of the blind man in John 9, it's easy to miss the significance of the fact that the man didn't receive instant healing. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't the way anyone would have expected. But it was in that process that God revealed His power, His love, and His purpose. The man had to take action. He had to trust in Jesus' instructions, even though they didn't make sense. And through that process, not only was his sight restored, but God's glory was revealed to everyone around him. Sometimes the process of restoration isn't just for us, it's for others too. God is working in us, but He's also working through us to show the world His glory. This is where the trust comes in. When we're in the middle of a season where we can't see clearly, where we're uncertain of what God is doing, it's easy to get frustrated. It's easy to want to take matters into our own hands and try to fix things ourselves. But when we trust God's timing, we recognize that He is the one who knows the way. He knows how to restore our sight. He knows how to bring clarity and direction. Even when we don't understand the process, we can trust that He is working things out for our good. God's timing is perfect because it is always motivated by love. He sees the bigger picture, the full scope of our lives, and He knows exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. It's like a parent who carefully plans and prepares for their child. They know the importance of the lessons along the way, even when the child doesn't understand why they have to wait. God, as our loving Father, knows the importance of the lessons in our lives. He knows that the waiting is just as important as the healing. He knows that the process will shape us and mold us into the people He created us to be. I know it's hard to wait. I know that sometimes it feels like God is silent, like He's not answering your prayers, or like He's not working. But I promise you, He is. He is never late. His timing is perfect, even when it feels like He's taking too long. And sometimes the reason we can't see clearly is because we are looking for the wrong things. We want the instant fix, the quick solution, the immediate restoration, but God is looking at the bigger picture. He is working in ways we can't always see or understand, and He is more concerned with our hearts and our growth than with our immediate comfort. I've been there. I've been in seasons where I felt spiritually blind, where I didn't know which way to go, where I was questioning everything. And in those moments, it felt like I was waiting forever for God to move, for Him to restore my sight. But looking back, I can see now that it was in those seasons that I grew the most. It was in the waiting that God was doing a deeper work in me, teaching me to trust Him, to rely on His timing, and to surrender my own plans. He wasn't just restoring my sight, He was shaping my heart, refining my character, and teaching me to walk by faith, not by sight. So if you find yourself in a season where you're struggling to see clearly, where everything feels uncertain, and where you're wondering why it's taking so long for God to move, I want to encourage you. Trust the process. Trust that God is working even when you can't see it. Trust that His timing is perfect. Trust that He is shaping you, refining you, and preparing you for the fullness of what He has for your life. Restoration takes time. It's a journey, not a destination. And if you will trust God's process, if you will surrender to His timing, you will find that the restoration of your sight is not just a moment of healing, but a transformation that will impact every area of your life. Waiting on God is not passive. It's an active choice to trust, to believe, and to wait with expectation. It's saying, God, I don't understand this process. I don't know why it's taking so long, but I trust that You are good. I trust that You are working even when I can't see it. And I trust that Your timing is perfect. It's in that trust, in that surrender, that we begin to experience the full restoration of our spiritual sight. So hold on, keep trusting, keep believing. God is working and His timing will never fail. Sometimes one of the most challenging aspects of restoring our spiritual sight is dealing with the obstacles that we face along the way. Life isn't just about going through good seasons or easy moments where everything feels right and we can see clearly. It's about recognizing that spiritual sight doesn't always come without resistance. There will be times when the enemy, when doubt, when distractions, and even our own hearts try to cloud our vision. These are the moments that test our faith, our trust in God, and our resolve to continue seeking Him. These are the moments when we're tempted to give up, to lose hope, and to allow the obstacles to define us. But I want to remind you today, the obstacles you face are not the end of your story. They are not the final word. They are not the thing that will ultimately keep you from seeing clearly again. God is bigger than every obstacle in your life. He is stronger than every barrier that stands in the way of your healing, your restoration, and your clarity. We need to recognize that restoration doesn't come without resistance. In fact, the restoration of your spiritual sight is often preceded by a season of testing, a season of challenge. Why? Because spiritual sight is precious. It's a gift that God gives us. And in order to appreciate that gift, we need to go through a refining process. We need to learn how to hold on to our faith in the midst of the fog, in the midst of the noise. We need to learn to press into God when everything around us is trying to pull us in the other direction. Obstacles are inevitable, but they don't have to derail us. They can actually strengthen us. They can build in us the perseverance and the faith we need to press forward. The first obstacle that often stands in our way is the obstacle of distraction. We live in a world that is full of noise, full of things trying to get our attention. Our phones are constantly buzzing, our to-do lists are always growing, and the demands of life can feel overwhelming. In the midst of all this noise, it's easy to lose sight of what truly matters. We get so caught up in the distractions that we forget to focus on the one thing that can restore our sight, God. Distraction pulls us away from the truth. It pulls us away from God's presence. It pulls us away from the time we need to spend with Him in order to get the clarity we're searching for. I've seen this happen in my own life. There are times when I'm seeking God, when I'm praying, when I'm trying to get my spiritual vision back, but then I'm distracted by the chaos of life. Something happens, and suddenly my mind is no longer fixed on God's truth. My eyes start to wander. I begin to pay more attention to the noise around me than to the still, quiet voice of God. And in those moments, my vision becomes clouded. The fog sets in. But the truth is, we have to learn how to shut out the distractions. We have to recognize that in order to restore our sight, we need to create space in our lives for God to move. This means turning off the noise, stepping away from the chaos, and allowing ourselves to truly focus on Him. It's in that stillness, in that focus, that our spiritual sight is restored. Another obstacle that we face is the obstacle of doubt. I know that there are moments when you look around and think, God, where are you? Why can't I see? Why am I still in this dark place? We have all experienced seasons of doubt, seasons when we're not sure if God hears us or if He even cares. When things aren't happening the way we expect them to, it's easy to start questioning everything. We doubt our faith, we doubt God's goodness, and we doubt whether or not our prayers are making any difference. In those moments, it feels like the fog has set in and we're stuck in a place of uncertainty. But I want to encourage you with this. Doubt is not the enemy of faith. In fact, doubt is often the thing that drives us to a deeper, more authentic relationship with God. When we doubt, it's not a sign that God is distant or that He's not there. It's an opportunity to dig deeper, to press in closer. It's in the moments of doubt that we are invited to bring our questions, our fears, and our uncertainties to God, knowing that He is big enough to handle them. It's in our doubts that God has the chance to show Himself faithful. Doubt doesn't have to paralyze you. It doesn't have to define your faith. It can actually lead you to a deeper place of trust, because when you allow God to meet you in your doubts, He will show up in ways that strengthen your faith and give you the clarity you need. The third obstacle that stands in our way is the obstacle of fear. Fear is something that can paralyze us, can keep us from moving forward. Fear tells us that we're not good enough, that we're not worthy of God's healing, that we'll never be able to see clearly again. Fear keeps us stuck in the darkness, afraid to take the next step. It makes us believe that we are too broken, too far gone, or too insignificant for God to do something in our lives. It's in these moments that fear tries to steal our spiritual sight, tries to convince us that there is no hope, no way forward. But I want to remind you today, God has not given us a spirit of fear. He has given us a spirit of power, love, and a sound mind. The fear that you feel is not from God. It's a tool that the enemy uses to keep you stuck, to keep you from walking in the freedom that God has for you. When you begin to feel the weight of fear, I want you to remember the words of God in Isaiah 41:10. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. God is with you in your fear. He will strengthen you. He will uphold you. He will walk with you through the darkest valley. And when you begin to face fear head on, when you refuse to let it control you, you will begin to see again. Your spiritual sight will be restored not because fear is gone, but because you have chosen to trust God in the face of fear. The fourth obstacle is one that often hits us the hardest. The obstacle of our own heart. We are often our own biggest obstacle. We hold on to bitterness, unforgiveness, anger, or past wounds. And these things cloud our vision. Our hearts become hardened, and we can't see clearly because we are looking through a lens of hurt, disappointment, or resentment. We allow our past to define our present, and we allow our pain to dictate the way we see the world. This is a trap that the enemy loves to use. When we allow our hearts to remain closed off, when we refuse to forgive or let go of the past, it's like putting on a pair of spiritual blinders that prevent us from seeing the truth. But I want to remind you of something powerful. God is in the business of healing hearts. He is in the business of restoring what has been broken. He is in the business of taking our wounds, our scars, and turning them into something beautiful. If you want to restore your spiritual sight, you have to allow God to heal your heart. You have to let go of the bitterness, the unforgiveness, and the hurt that has been clouding your vision. I know it's not easy. I know it feels impossible at times, but God's love is bigger than your pain. His grace is deeper than your wounds. When you allow Him to heal your heart, He will also restore your sight. He will open your eyes to see His love, His purpose, and His plan in a way you've never seen before. Lastly, one of the biggest obstacles to restoring our spiritual sight is simply the obstacle of impatience. We live in a culture where everything is expected to happen quickly. We want results now. We want answers now. And when we don't see immediate results, we get discouraged. We start questioning whether it's even worth it to keep going, to keep seeking, to keep praying. But the truth is, God's restoration doesn't happen on our timeline. It happens in His perfect timing. Sometimes it takes longer than we expect. Sometimes it's a journey, not a destination. But in the waiting, God is doing something deep. He's shaping your character. He's teaching you to trust. He's giving you the clarity you need, but it comes with time. Don't rush the process. Don't get impatient with God. He's doing something beautiful in you. And when the time is right, He will restore your sight completely. So let me encourage you today. When you face obstacles, don't let them stop you. Recognize them for what they are. Challenges that will ultimately strengthen you. They're not signs that God is not working. They are opportunities for you to grow, to trust, and to rely on God's strength. When you face distractions, when you struggle with doubt or fear, when you wrestle with your own heart, know this: God is with you. He is fighting for you, and He will restore your sight even in the midst of the hardest battles. Keep pressing forward. Keep trusting. Keep seeking. God is faithful, and His restoration is worth the journey. There is something profoundly powerful in the way God calls us to move forward despite the challenges, despite the setbacks, and despite the overwhelming feelings of discouragement that often rise in our hearts when we can't seem to see what's ahead. One of the hardest parts of restoring our spiritual sight is understanding that God works in the unseen. He doesn't always reveal everything to us right away. Often He asks us to step forward in faith, not knowing where the next step will lead. This can be one of the most difficult things to accept, especially when we are longing for clarity, for answers, for some sense of direction that can help us feel secure again. But the truth is, God often works in the hidden places, in the quiet moments where our trust in Him is the only thing that keeps us going. It's in these spaces that our faith is stretched and our spiritual sight is restored. It's not about what we can see with our physical eyes. It's about trusting in what God is doing behind the scenes, even when we can't fully comprehend it. We have to learn to walk by faith, not by sight. This can be difficult, especially in a world where everything is measured by immediate results and visible outcomes. But God's ways are different. His work in our lives often unfolds in layers, in seasons, and it takes time. When I reflect on moments of spiritual blindness in my own life, I realize that the periods when I couldn't see clearly were often the moments when God was doing the deepest work in me. It wasn't always an immediate or obvious transformation, but it was in those difficult seasons that my heart was being shaped, that my spirit was being refined. I was learning how to lean on God more fully, how to trust His leading, even when I couldn't understand why things were happening the way they were. And what I've come to learn is that this process of spiritual restoration requires us to trust that God is at work, even when we can't see the full picture. When we talk about restoration, it's important to understand that it's not just about seeing clearly again in the sense of gaining new perspective. It's also about rebuilding what has been broken, healing what has been wounded, and reestablishing a sense of purpose and direction that only comes from the Father. There is a deep sense of renewal that happens when we allow God to restore our spiritual sight. This renewal doesn't just affect our perception of the world around us. It transforms how we see ourselves and how we relate to God. It's easy to get caught in the whirlwind of emotions when we feel spiritually blind. The frustration, the confusion, the anger, the sorrow, it all rushes in when we can't find our way or when we feel lost in the darkness. There's a sense of helplessness that comes with that, isn't there? When we feel disconnected from God, when we're unsure where He is, when we pray and feel like our prayers aren't reaching His ears, it's easy to get discouraged. It's in those moments that our emotions can sometimes become the loudest voices in our mind. The doubt, the fear, the insecurity, they speak louder than the truth of who God is. They try to convince us that we're too far gone, that God has forgotten about us, or that we'll never find our way back to Him. But the truth is, those emotions, as real as they are, do not define us. They do not have the final say over our lives. Just because you feel disconnected doesn't mean you are just because you feel blind doesn't mean you are abandoned. God's presence isn't dependent on our feelings. Even when we don't feel Him, He is with us. Even when we can't see His hand at work, He is moving on our behalf. His promises are steadfast. His love for us is unwavering. He will never leave us or forsake us. And while it may feel like we're walking through darkness, the truth is that the light of His love is always with us, always guiding us, always leading us to where we need to go. This is where we begin to understand that spiritual restoration is not just about gaining sight. It's about learning to trust in the God who sees us, even when we can't see ourselves. It's about recognizing that His vision for our lives is clearer than any vision we could ever have for ourselves. When we allow God to restore our sight, it's not just about us finding clarity or understanding. It's about us surrendering to His perfect will. It's about saying, God, I trust You even in the fog. I trust You even when I don't understand. I trust that You are good even when life feels uncertain. It's incredibly hard to do this, I know. There are days when the weight of uncertainty feels like it's pressing down on us. And the temptation is to fixate on the problems, the questions, the things we don't understand. We want answers. We want solutions. We want the fog to clear right now. But God's restoration is a process, and part of that process is learning to trust Him in the waiting. It's about choosing to step forward in faith even when the path ahead is unclear. In those moments when we can't see, when we feel like we're stumbling, I want to remind you of something incredibly important. God is always leading us somewhere. Even in the moments of uncertainty, even in the fog, He is directing our steps. He is still working, even when it feels like nothing is happening. In fact, it's often in the moments of waiting, in the moments of feeling lost, that God is preparing us for something greater. He is doing a deep work within us, strengthening us, refining us, preparing us for the clarity that is yet to come. And while it might be hard to see now, the clarity you're searching for is coming. The restoration of your spiritual sight is not something that will be delayed forever. There is a purpose in this waiting. There is a purpose in this season of feeling lost, of feeling unsure, of feeling disconnected. God is working in ways you cannot see right now. He is doing things that you can't understand, but one day when the fog lifts, you will see the beauty of his plan for your life. You will see the steps he's been leading you through. You will see how he has been shaping you, strengthening you, and preparing you for the next season of your life. This is where faith becomes so powerful. Faith is the ability to believe in what we cannot see. It's about trusting that God is good, even when life feels hard. It's about believing that he is working for our good, even when we can't see how. And when we begin to walk in that kind of faith, when we begin to trust God, even in the dark, we start to realize that our spiritual sight is being restored. Not just because we can see the answers right now, but because we are learning to trust the one who holds all the answers. It's important to note that this restoration doesn't just happen overnight. It's a journey. It's a process that requires patience, perseverance, and a deep reliance on God. And just like with physical sight, spiritual sight is something that requires constant care. We don't just restore our vision once and then forget about it. We have to continue walking in faith, continue trusting, continue seeking God in the midst of the fog. We have to keep our eyes fixed on him, even when the world around us is trying to pull us away. We have to choose to see through the eyes of faith, to believe that God is always working, even when we can't perceive it. There will be moments of doubt. There will be moments when we want to give up. But remember this, the God who restored your sight in the first place is the same God who will continue to restore it over and over again. He is faithful, he is unchanging, and he will not leave you in the dark forever. The clarity you are seeking is coming, but it comes with time, with patience, with trust. Trust the process. Trust that God is working in ways that you can't yet see. And as you trust him, as you step forward in faith, your spiritual sight will be restored in ways you never imagined possible. The fog will lift, the darkness will clear, and you will see his plan for your life with a clarity you never thought possible. So keep walking, keep trusting, keep believing, because God is faithful and he is restoring your sight step by step, moment by moment, day by day. And the restoration he is bringing is not just for today, but for the future he is preparing you for.